So welcome to the webinar, Who Am I? A conversation about identity, donor conception, and family, brought to you by the Humanities Center at Carleton College and Ethical Inquiry at Carleton College, both in Northfield, Minnesota. I'm Samantha Brennan, and I'm the moderator for this event. I'm also Dean of the College of Arts at the University of Guelph in Guelph, Ontario, in Canada, and I'm a philosopher who's written about family ethics, and so I'm very interested in tonight's conversation. Donor conception and the increased access to family history through home DNA testing raises questions that are relevant to all of us. What makes me me? What is a family? Is it important to know about your genetic lineage? How much? Tonight's conversation takes place during Family History Month, and we'll cover these questions as well as engage with questions submitted by you, our attendees to this virtual discussion. So let me start by introducing our participants, our panelists. Daniel Groll is an associate professor of philosophy at Carleton College in Northfield, Minnesota, and an affiliate faculty member at the Center for Bioethics at the University of Minnesota. He's the author of Conceiving People, Genetic Knowledge and the Ethics of Sperm and Egg Donation, which came out with Oxford University Press this past August. You can visit www.danielgroll.com for a code that will get you a 30% discount on the book. And when he's not doing philosophy, Daniel's making music for families with Lewis and Dan and the Invisible Band. Our next panelist is Anya Steinberg. Anya just graduated from Colorado College with a degree in environmental science and race, ethnicity, and migration studies. She works as a radio journalist and is currently an intern at the NPR podcast Throughline. She's also the winner of NPR Student Podcast Challenge 2021 with her wonderful podcast, He's Just 23 Chromosomes, which tells the story of her search for her donor dad. Finally, Libby Copeland is an award-winning journalist and author who writes about culture and science for outlets including the Washington Post, the New York Times, and the Atlantic. Her book, The Lost Family, How DNA Testing is Upending Who We Are, examines the profound impact of consumer genetic testing on identity, family, and American culture broadly. The Lost Family was named to the Guardian's list of the best books of 2020, and the Washington Post said it reads like an Agatha Christie mystery, which wrestles with some of the biggest questions in life. Who are we? What is family? And are we defined by nature, nurture, or both? So those are the panelists. And now over to your role as participants. We'd like it if you'd use the chat to tell us where you're from and ask us some questions. You'll see among the people who are here, we also have Krista Askeland, an administrative assistant from the Department of Philosophy, and Maya Donovan, a student at Carleton, and they'll both be helping us with the chat when we get there. Our plan is, in the final 15 minutes, I'll be sharing some of your questions with Daniel, Anya, and Libby. But now I'm going to start with one of my questions. It's a question for all three of our panelists, which is, can you tell me about your connection to today's topic? And especially for people who aren't familiar with your work, what got you interested in thinking and writing about identity and genetic relatedness? And for Anya, maybe you can go first. Maybe the best way to ask this question is, what prompted you to share your story? Over to you, Anya.
Thank you. Hi, everyone. I can't see you, but it's good to be here. And yeah, I guess the primary reason that I wanted to share my story is I wanted to win the contest. No, but for less shallow reasons. It was just an opportunity for me to talk to my family about it, candidly, making the podcast, that is. And it was an excuse to hear their thoughts because I got to ask them whatever questions I wanted because I was holding the microphone. And they had to answer. But once I shared it, I realized that I had tapped into this whole community that I didn't even know existed. People were following me on social media and sending me private messages, telling me how great it was to hear my perspective and sharing their own stories with me, which was a really cool community to stumble upon, of other donor conceived people. And I didn't expect that. So yeah, that's kind of where my story comes from.
How about you, Daniel?
Yeah, so I routinely teach a course in family ethics, although that just leads to the question, why do I teach that? So I come from a family, I have three siblings, all of whom are adopted, but my most direct connection to this world is that I am a known donor to very dear friends in Toronto. And just to say a little something about what that means, obviously they know who I am, but more importantly, their children know who I am and what I am. So that's what I mean when I say that I'm a known donor. So that's my connection.
And Libby?
Yeah, so I'm a journalist. I'm very interested in the intersection of science and culture and sort of the forces that shape us sometimes in ways we don't even quite realize. And I've been writing about DNA testing for years and have talked to a lot of people who discovered things about their own genetic origins that they did not know about through DNA testing. And I'm fascinated by that experience, and I think it's incredibly important to explore and for people to tell their stories and be able to share their commonalities because we are in kind of an unprecedented era in terms of the scale of people who are discovering that they don't know the identity of one or both of their genetic parents as a result of DNA testing. And it's remaking our culture, it's remaking our family, it's remaking how people think about themselves, and it's profoundly reshaping people's lives. And I think we can't talk about it enough. I think it's incredibly important.
Thanks. I was wondering if you could talk a bit about the industry, just because it's such a big industry of home genetic testing. How long it's been around, how big it is, and the kind of impact that you think it's having.
Yeah, it started 21 years ago in a little company that thought that it was going to be like a niche company for serious family history enthusiasts. The product that was originally being offered in the context of this home DNA testing for ancestry purposes was so crude compared to what's available now, so expensive, so not useful unless you worked really hard to make it mean something, that it was really a product for like the most dedicated people, right? And what happened over the last decade is that something called autosomal DNA testing emerged. And autosomal DNA testing is the kind of testing we're all familiar with, right? If you've heard of the main companies, Ancestry, 23andMe, MyHeritage, Family Tree DNA, that's autosomal DNA testing, where you're looking at your DNA from your mother and your father, and you're getting your list of DNA cousins in the databases, and you're finding an ethnicity estimate that tries to tell you where your people are from. And that has grown so much that it has become a casual consumer item, right? It's gone from something that was for people who are really into genealogy to something that you get for a person in your life as a gift because you can't think what else to get them because they already have everything, right? And it's on sale. And so, and people are just buying it. To give you an idea, when I started writing The Lost Family, it was 4 years ago. It was the summer of 2017, and there were 8 million DNA test kits sold across those 4 companies that I mentioned. Today, we're closing out on close to 40 million. And most of those 40 million buyers, consumers, are in the United States. So we are absolutely saturated. And we're pretty much at the point now as a culture where even if you've never taken a test, someone who's genetically related to you has. And so in a sense, none of us are invisible. It means that most of us are potentially identifiable. And that also means that family secrets are essentially over. And that in the very near future, there won't be such a thing as someone who doesn't know the truth about their genetic origins anymore. So we're sort of going into a new era of intergenerational reckoning and big conversations that we need to be having as a culture about where we are and how things are changing.
I loved your description in the book, by the way, of having to keep track on Twitter every day to see that new developments hadn't happened because so much was happening as you were writing the book. That would have been a terrifying book to write in that respect. So my next question is for Anya, and I'm wondering if you could tell us a bit about the process of trying to figure out what your donor parent's identity, what that process looked like. So what kind of hoops were there in the industry that what they made you jump through? What kind of barriers are to the knowledge? How do you feel about the process and trying to navigate it as someone who's done this?
Yeah, it's a great question. I would say the first step was like actually just realizing that I wanted to know, because not every donor conceived person cares or like feels like it has any sort of bearing on their life, like the person that they're genetically related to. But there like came a time in my life where I really felt like there was this hole like of my understanding of myself. And that's like when I felt like I was ready to reach out and try and search. And that also kind of coincided with the fact that I wasn't necessarily like too afraid anymore to go looking, because there was always a possibility that you're not going to find any answers. And if you're not ready for that, like that can be soul crushing, just like, you know, if you're an adoptive child looking for your birth parents. Yeah, I think in terms of like the industry process, the first thing that I did was take like my donor ID number and go to the cryobank website and just search it. And from there, you get like 2 free PDFs of information that just say really rudimentary things like my favorite food is pasta and my eyes are brown and I'm 170 pounds. And so like that was like cool on one level, but also it's just like the like most bare bones facts that you could know about a person. It's like a third grader's like school project that they bring to class in terms of like depth. And like the rest of everything, you have to pay money to access different levels of information, including like medical records and like photos, if there are photos, and yeah, just any sort of like information beyond basic information. There's like a paywall basically. And then there's like other websites where you can find like registries of your donor siblings, like the donor siblings registry, I think it's specifically called. And I went there and they show you like for free that you do have siblings, but you have to pay to be able to message them or see any like details about them. So I do know that I do have some siblings, half siblings, but I did not pay the like $150 to find out who they were, because I just graduated from college and that's not in my disposable income plan right now. And yeah, I think like in terms of how I felt navigating the process, it was somewhat frustrating, because when I reached out to the cryobank to see if they would contact like my donor father on my behalf, they said that they would. And then like a couple months went by and they just emailed me back and said, you know, we tried and he didn't answer, so that's all we can do for you, which was really disappointing, and also like raised a lot of questions for me as to like, how did you try? And like, you know, this person donated in 1991. Who's to say 30 years later they haven't moved away or, you know, changed their address or like any of the things that you have on file for this person? And like, did you write them a letter? Did you send them an email? I don't even know if email existed in 1991. But yeah, it's just a lot of questions about like, how hard should they have had to try on my behalf? And like, what right do I have to know, you know, like what kinds of records should they be keeping? Yeah, that's all tangent, but basically what I felt was frustration.
Yeah, I get that. So Daniel, this is a question for Daniel and Libby, but is it true now that we're in the age of consumer DNA testing that there's no such thing as an anonymous sperm donor anymore? And is that true, and how is it playing out?
Well, I think Libby can probably do a better job answering whether, in fact, the age of anonymity is over, and it sounds like it is. But I think one thing worth mentioning, and Anya's story highlights this so well, is that even if, as a matter of fact, anonymity will soon be a thing of the past, there's a really big difference between putting the burden on someone who was conceived with the gametes of someone who preferred not to be known, and then putting it on the burden of someone like Anya to go find that person who preferred not to be known and have to figure out who it is and then initiate contact knowing that the person was an anonymous donor. Ethically, there's a big difference between that and using someone who went into the process saying, I'm willing to be known, I'm willing to be contacted. So sometimes I think if you hear people say, well, this, questions about anonymous versus non-anonymous donation kind of don't matter anymore because anonymity is going out the window. I think that's not right, because the process then of finding out who your genetic parent is looks really different if you are searching, having to pay, having to deal with reaching out to someone who didn't want to be known versus knowing that the information is there and that someone went into the process knowing very well that an email may show up, or a letter may show up, or a phone call might happen. So I'll pass it off to Libby.
Yeah, so for sure, I mean, yes, there's no such thing as an anonymous sperm donor anymore. There's a guy who heads one of these companies, the oldest one down in Houston, Texas, who likes to talk about the fact that the phrase anonymous sperm donor is now an oxymoron akin to the phrase jumbo shrimp. And he's been saying that for years at talks. Why are anonymous sperm donors no longer anonymous? The reason is that you do not have to spit into a vial and show up in a database in order to be identifiable. Right. So let's just start there. Right. So if you donated sperm in 1975 and you think, well, I just won't take a test with Ancestry and then no one will be able to find me. Well, that's not reality anymore, because you have a second cousin. You have a third cousin whose name you don't even know, right? You've never even heard of this person. They have taken a test. They've effectively opted you in. Why is that? Because we know that people are potentially identifiable from a third cousin match or closer, ideally a few more than one cousin. And from that information, somebody can do the genealogical research. They can go back. They can locate a most recent common ancestor from some cousins. They can come back. They can do reverse genealogy. And then they can use the enormous amount of data we give out about ourselves online, on social media, and everywhere on the internet to figure out who the identity is of their sperm donor, or the person whose sperm was actually purchased from, and write a letter, say, to them, or they'll know that it's one of two brothers and they write a letter to both of them, right? And they contact them. It simply means that we're entering a new world. One of the stories that I write in my book, The Lost Family, is about a man who did exactly this, right? He donated in the 70s. It was his wife's idea. She was like, this will be the thing that will allow us to make the rent. It will be the monthly difference, right? And he said, and I'm helping people create families. It's, $25 per, he felt pretty good about it. He never anticipated, and frankly, nobody anticipated the DNA age. Now he has, at latest date, 24 genetic children, 2 of whom he raised and 22 of whom he did not. And talking to him about the delicacy and the grace that he needs to bring to these relationships, where he is so careful because he knows that, these adult children reaching out to him, they already have dads, and he needs to be respectful of those relationships and kind of let them guide. And, this is a space that this man, Robert, never imagined he would find himself in. And that's just sort of one of many, many, many stories from many, many perspectives that I think are part of this new world. And I just want to say one thing about something that Anya said, which I thought was so kind of beautiful and striking to me. I think she used the phrase, Anya, that you said that there was like a hole in you where you wanted to search. I think you used that word. And I just want to say, that is something I've heard from so many folks, right? And that idea of looking for that piece is, maybe something we'll talk about more. And granted, the folks that I've interviewed are self-selecting, and there are certainly people who I'm not talking to who are not searching. But the people who I know who are searching, they really feel this intense desire to really know more about themselves through understanding where they come from. And that feeling is something that you hear over and over again for people who were conceived through assisted conception, and looking for the strangers who contributed half their genetic material.
Thanks. So how has this changed, do you think, the way people have talk to their children and talk in families about assisted reproduction from sort of when people first started using assisted reproduction to now? How have those conversations changed, do you think?
Already there's been a change just in terms of how parents talk to their children, in terms of disclosing how they were conceived. That's been a change over decades. If you look back in the sort of earlier in the 20th century, there was a lot of advice around not disclosing to children that they had been conceived in this way. And that advice came from a number of corners. It came from psychologists, it came from legal experts, and doctors. And what they said was that if you told a child that the man that their dad was not genetically related to them, that there could be an impact legally, socially and psychologically in terms of the bond, and that the family would not persist. It would not be strong. And so parents were actually told not to tell their children, right? And that was also true in the context to some degree as well of adopted children, that there was less disclosure and certainly, fewer open adoptions. And we've moved towards understanding that it is better for everyone, the research says, when these things are disclosed early, right? And the more openness and transparency, the better. And sort of the child makes that part of their narrative and their identity, and it's part of the family's identity. And I think, as we move then into more of a sense of awareness within the culture that DNA testing is making it so that more of these disclosures are coming out, particularly for people who were conceived, say, 50, 60 years ago and weren't told because of those sort of cultural practices and stigmas around infertility of the time. I think moving forward, more parents will be aware of the fact that this is not something that they can hold back, that this is something that they need to disclose, early on.
Thanks. So Anya, in your family, when you found out you were donor conceived, how did this shape your family relationships and the kind of conversations that were going on in your home?
Yeah, I mean, the debate that Libby was talking about was like playing out in my family in the early 2000s or whatever. I mean, my dad, who is the person who I'm not biologically related to, he didn't ever want me and my brother to know that we were donor conceived. And like my mom always wanted us to know, like from the get-go. So it was definitely like an argument that I think shaped how they talked about it and didn't talk about it. And like it wasn't something that we talked about until after my parents had divorced, which I think, my mom was like, I'm not even married to you anymore. I'm not going to listen to you. I'm telling my kids. And that like shaped at least my brother and my relationships with my dad for like the rest of our lives up until now, pretty much. Because I think that for my dad, at least, it was not easy for him to accept that like we weren't related to him. And even though like me and my brother might have been willing to like move past that and be like, this doesn't matter, like our relationship is our relationship, it was just became this barrier. And like I think it was something that was wrapped up in a lot of shame for him, and it definitely like coincided with like the basically like destruction of our relationship with him. And I talked about this a little bit in my podcast, but like around that time we just like, the way that I talk about in my podcast is like, maybe I don't have the answers, but maybe it's like, we just realized like, because we're not related, we don't owe each other anything. And like, that gave both parties a reason not to try anymore. And I mean, on one side, like me and my brother are kids, we're like 8 and 5. So that's one thing compared to like an adult man who is like supposed to act as like a guardian. But like on both sides, we definitely just like let the relationship fall apart. And like, it's interesting to think about now because like, he doesn't offer anything as like a father necessarily. And so when I think about like, who is my father, like the question of this person who raised me for part of my life versus like who I don't really speak to anymore versus the anonymous sperm donor, like they both have like equal weight of like fathership in my mind, I guess. And yeah.
Thanks. So now an ethics question for Daniel, which is kind of what weight do we give to the desire of donor conceived people to know their genetic origins? How should we think about that desire?
Yeah, I mean, I think the short answer is we should give a lot of weight. I think we know that, I think the thing that's come up twice is that not everyone is interested, and I think that matters too, and we can talk about that later. But what we do know is that not just donor-conceived people, but certainly most donor-conceived people are interested in having this information. And so I think if you know in advance when you're creating a child that they're likely to have this strong, persistent interest, something that to some extent will figure prominently in their life, and you're in a position to help them satisfy that interest by making a certain kind of choice, in this case, using an identity release donor or an open donor, then you should do that because part of, I think, a parent's responsibility is to help their children achieve what they set out to achieve. So I think it matters a lot that in fact, donor-conceived people tend to want this information. Things would look really, really different if most donor-conceived people were totally indifferent. Then there wouldn't be this pressing issue. But it's the fact that that they do, and that maybe we didn't know this 50 years ago, but it seems like we do now, that it is foreseeable, it's predictable that this is likely to come up. Then you should put your kid in a position to know. Now, just to say briefly, you might think one way around this is to not disclose if you're in the position not to disclose. But I think that's not an acceptable option either. Some of the reasons have already come out. Secrets are really, really hard to keep. Very hard to keep. And so you run this real risk of it coming out at some point. Given what Libby's told us, an increasing likelihood it will come out. And then you've got many years of frankly, deceit to explain. And all the mistrust that comes with that, and the damage done to someone who's had their understanding of where they come from, the rug pulled out from under them. But even if a secret could be perfectly kept, this is like the philosopher's thought experiment, even if a secret could be perfectly kept, I still think it would be wrong to keep it from someone, because I think frankly, I think it's deceptive. I think to the extent that the secret can be kept well, it depends on inducing in children this thought that their family conforms to what we might call the bionormative picture of a mother and a father genetically related to their children. And if you're in a family with a mom and a dad, you can then sort of take advantage of that default assumption and have the kid go on through life with this false belief, which I think is a pretty important false belief. So it's not just about avoiding damage later, avoiding relationships torn asunder because of mistrust. I think it's also a point about respect and the kind of information that people are owed, whether it could be successfully kept from them or not.
So does it matter, do you think, and this is a thing some philosophers have worried about, does it matter? So I'm thinking Sally Haslanger, Charlotte Witt, but others as well have worried about where the desire to know comes from.
Yeah.
We're living in a society that's highly bionormative, that gives a great deal of weight to genetic relatedness. And in that context, it makes sense that you might want to know, but you might also want to be critical of the context. So how do we put those things together? Yeah,
it's a great question. So I think right. I think there can be a tendency in talking about the interest to treat it as given, as natural in the sense that it's not culturally mediated at all, and that it's universal. And I think we should resist all three of those assumptions I've already mentioned. I think there are people who genuinely aren't interested and lead flourishing lives. It's just not a part of their self-conception. Is not built in terms of what we might call genetic knowledge. I think that matters. That suggests that I think the very strongest versions of the view that you must have this in order to know who you are too strong. And then I think, as you suggest, right? I mean, to say that a desire is culturally mediated, because as you mentioned, we live in a society that tends to have what Charlotte Witt calls, portrays the nuclear family as the gold standard, mom, dad, genetically related to their kids, and that versions that fall away from that are a kind of like falling away, a kind of second best. And so if you grow up in one of those families, it makes a lot of sense that you would come to feel like you're missing something. Now, to say that a desire is culturally mediated is definitely, I want to be really clear, is not to say that it's not real, and it's not to say that it's not significant. I think all kinds of our interests and desires are culturally mediated and highly significant. But I think it means that we kind of have twin tasks. So one is taking very seriously the desire of donor-conceived people to have genetic knowledge. And I think people making choices both as individuals but also at the level of industry and policy to allow that desire to be satisfied. But then also simultaneously recognizing the structures in our society that perhaps generate the desire to some extent by giving us a picture of the family that unjustifiably valorizes a particular notion of what makes a family a family. So if we have on the one side the work to do to help make genetic knowledge available, we have work on this other side, I think, to really think hard and push back about the ways in which our society is deeply bionormative and puts a huge amount of stock in genetic connectedness in a way that I think is often reductive and simplistic. So it's both and.
Thanks. Now we have someone here who deeply cares. Anya, you deeply care, and you went down the road of trying to find out. And can you talk to us about caring about knowing about your genetic origins and what that means to you? And how do you feel that knowing some of that information changed things for you?
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting to hear Daniel's answer because, I'm not a philosophy professor. But I think like from my personal experience, knowing like my genetic origins is so tied to my understanding of like myself. And I guess to like be more specific, like my biological mother is white and my donor dad is Korean, so I'm half Korean, half white. And like for me, like my racial identity and like cultural identity is like a whole piece of myself that's like missing, that because of like this relationship with my dad who isn't around anymore, like it's really a side that I like have no chance to explore. And like for so many people, and I think like so many Asian Americans, like I don't want to speak for all Asian Americans, but like it's really important, like the idea of family and like your immigration story and where and when you came from, like whatever country you came from. And like this is all information that like I have no access to because I don't know who is the person who is like genetically related to me. And yeah, and I think it's just an interesting question of like, of course I can go out and like buy a Korean cookbook and like learn to cook recipes, but like, isn't it so much more meaningful if I'm not learning like my heritage language from Duolingo, but I'm learning it from like someone who is passing that down like through me, through like the generations of our family. And I think that's like kind of the complicated relationship I have to like wanting to know my genetic origin that I don't think I would have if I had had like a strong relationship to like the dad that is in my life, my non-biological dad. And yeah, because that doesn't exist. Like, I think I've really been driven to like discover, that whole piece of myself that's missing. Yeah.
And a reminder to people who are listening, if you have questions, we'll have time at the end and you can put them in the Q&A or the chat and we'll get your questions and come to them shortly. I want to know, panelists, what you say to people who don't care. And I often think of myself as an example of someone who doesn't care. I guess I know who my genetic parents are, but much beyond that is shaky. And I tried to do family history as a result of doing a breast cancer screening and realized I could not go back very far at all. I have the kind of working class immigrant family where I don't know very many of my relatives. I just have my family here in Canada and not very much else. And some pieces of my family, I'm struck by the contrast, are really concerned about knowing exactly where in Ireland we came from and exactly, they need a story about who we're related to. And I find myself not needing that story. And I'm not sure if it's like people who don't appreciate music or people who don't have a religious sensibility, that there's something I'm missing. So am I missing something? Me who doesn't care. Anyone who wants to start can start. Anya, do you want to?
Yeah, I can say just a few words, but I think like the most important like difference I would say is that there's like, I mean, even if you don't care, like there's still the option to know, beyond like you could go home and ask like your parents or, theoretically someone who is, knows their biological parents, both of them, like could go home and be like, where does our family come from? Like, what stories have you heard about? Like, every family has these legends of like my great great grandma invented the light bulb or like, things like that. And I think like having the option to know that without having to jump through the hoops of like paying hundreds of dollars or like being your own like detective of like swabbing your cheek and sending it to a company and like tracing your genealogical origins, just like having access to like the family history in a more, I guess I can't think of the word, but like it's accessible. Yeah.
Thanks. Libby?
Yeah, I mean, yeah, just to second what Anya said, yeah, it's right. It's the loveliness of having that choice, right? And then it takes talking to someone who doesn't have that choice to kind of be like, oh, wow, that's what it feels like to not have that choice, right? Yeah, I mean, there are lots of people who are just not into genealogy, right? We're really, really kind of uniquely into it right now as a country, and not just genealogy, but questions around identity having to do with one's parents and roots and just all that kind of stuff, right? And some of that is actually fueled, I think, by like a cultural moment we're in, and some of it is fueled by the fact that it's just easier to fall into the rabbit hole of genealogical research than it ever was, because there's so much available online in terms of records, and lots of people are doing DNA testing, and they kind of do it casually, and then they're like, wait a minute, this is really interesting, or wait a minute, this doesn't make any sense, I have a mystery on my hands. And then they become kind of seekers. They start asking questions and wanting to understand. I totally get that feeling of just kind of like not being that curious, because I think I spent my first few decades feeling like that, and recently started to get into it. And I will say that once you start, it's almost like a moving train that gets faster and faster when it goes down the hill. And you can find incredible meaning in understanding sort of how the people who shaped you, who you may never have met, but they're inside of you, inside of your cells, how those people influence your life in ways that they never even could have predicted. It's quite incredible, right? And I think we're only just sort of starting to understand how much influence they had and how we can trace them in us, and as well how much we define ourselves outside of them, for sure. This is not an argument for nature over everything else at all, but that kind of understanding of what we owe the past, and all the things that we didn't quite understand about the things that led up to us, we're in this amazing moment of being able to really kind of grasp that. And I think having the choice to be able to indulge in understanding how the past shaped you is increasingly something that Americans at least are wanting to exercise.
So if I could just, so I agree with everything Libby and Anya said. I mean, it seems really clear that exploring this, having this knowledge can be a profound source of meaning and can form the basis of constructing one's understanding of oneself. Samantha, your question was whether people who don't feel that are thereby missing something. And in one sense, the answer is yes, if what we mean by that is there a potential source of meaning that you're not tapping into? Sure. But I think we need to take really seriously that different people are different, and that we should take people's interests or lack thereof at face value, unless we have a reason to think they're self-deceived or something like that. So I think there's just a myriad sources of meaning in life. There's many different ways one can construct an identity. And so while I just want to be really clear, while I think those people, including probably most of us, who do find a tremendous amount of significance in knowing their genetic past, are tapping into something really worthwhile and interesting. A life is not thereby truncated or missing something if you're not interested. If you are interested and you can't get it, that's an issue. But I think I don't know if I want to push back. The only thing I would resist is this idea that this is something absolutely everybody needs in order to lead a full and flourishing life. Because just as I think we should take really, really seriously the voices of people who say, this is something I need, I think that could be absolutely true. I also think we should take seriously the voices of people who are like, this is just not massively significant to me. But that doesn't change the fact at all that given that it is really significant for many people, including most donor-conceived people, that they should be in a position to tap into that source of meaning.
I'm wondering if you think is there a peculiarly American thing about it? Because it does seem to be an American thing. Any thoughts about why, other than sort of the companies are there and doing the marketing there and the advertising there? I mostly encounter the advertising when I'm moving in an American context. I don't see it as much here in Canada.
You're asking why DNA testing and genealogy are big in the US. So this is sort of like putting to the side the kind of theme of the discussion that we're having and just sort of looking at this broadly through the population, right? Why are Americans in particular so interested in understanding the past and their DNA and genealogy? And I think a big part of that is that a lot of people who live in America came from someplace else. Either their people emigrated from someplace else or they were brought over against their will. Not everyone, but a lot of us. And then there's this pressure of assimilation, right? It's sort of, give up your whatever food it was you were making in the old country and conform to our Jell-O molds now because it's 1950, right? Or whatever, the bland foods were that were American, right? So be American and shed your language, religion, culture, practices. That's not always true, but in some decades, it was certainly very true, certainly for both sides of my family. And then you have this moment of people kind of looking up and it's 2021 and they realize they don't even know where their grandfather came from, right? In other places, it's not necessarily like that, so you talk to people who live in places elsewhere, maybe in Europe, and, I don't know how it is in Canada, but, having spoken with people who are, for instance, in Sweden or even in the UK, where it is popular, but not as popular as here, there's often more of a sense of like, I know where I came from because I came from here, and their communities may also be, depending on where they live, more homogeneous. So they're not like looking for that ethnicity pie chart that's going to tell them how X, what percentage XYZ they are, because they already have a sense that they, come from there and they know, and then I think there's that kind of cultural moment of, the TV shows and finding your roots and who do you think you are? And, other, kind of books and podcasts and things that are eliciting this desire to understand how much the past shapes us in the present.
Thanks. We should probably turn now to some of the questions we have from people who are joining us, and I'll share some of those questions, and whoever wants to answer them among the three of you can chime in. But one of the questions is there a significant difference between sperm and egg donor conceived people in how they feel about donation?
Do you mean the people conceived via?
Right, by egg donation or sperm donation? Is there more of a push towards information connection with one or the other? Is there a difference? Do we accept anonymity more likely with one than the other?
That is a great question. I don't know the answer. Let me answer like a slightly different question. I'll just throw a name out there. There's a sociologist at Yale named Renee Ameling, who wrote a book called Sex Cells, and cells is spelled C-E-L-L-S. It's a very clever title. One thing that she observes in her research is that sperm donors are much more likely to identify themselves as fathers than egg donors are mothers. And I think there's a really interesting question about why that is and what's going on. I don't know about any research that asks whether a donor-conceived person's interest in finding out information depends on whether they have a sperm donor or an egg donor. It would also be interesting to know whether that tracks family form at all, so whether it's more likely to come in cases of heterosexual families rather gay families. But I don't know the answers to those questions. They're great questions.
The next question is about for individuals who deliberately choose to remain anonymous, do they have an ethical obligation to create a relationship with their donor-conceived child? So due to the genetic relationship, what obligations do they have to their relatives? Is it just sharing medical history, or is it more, is it maintaining a relationship? You can imagine a continuum there from just the bare medical facts to actually having a role in the child's life. What's the ethical obligation consistent?
Anya, do you want to start on this one? I'd be interested to hear your thoughts before I
that's a good
opine.
Yeah, sure. Well, I think I just want to speak to like my own experience, not like the whole donor conceived community's experience, but just for me personally, like I'm not asking for child support or a check or anything like that. I'm not asking for him to help pay my student loans or, things that like parents would or could do for their kids. But just like, I think that I do have a right to know. And like, it would be nice in an ideal world for him to be interested in like speaking to me, because I'm definitely interested in speaking to him. And I think it is complicated because like, the details of like where I came from. I mean, I don't know under what circumstances he donated, but kind of what Libby was talking about earlier, like people who donate for a variety of reasons, but like they get paid to do it in the US. And so that means that a lot of people are coming to donate sperm under the impression that they're going to get $50 and walk away and never think about it again. And I think that's like a really interesting like situation to be conceived out of. And like, for that reason, I don't know how he would feel or does feel about like having donated, or if he ever thinks about like having biological children. But I would hope that he would feel like if we ever did connect someday, like that he would feel at least an obligation to like sit down and say hi.
I think there's two like slightly different questions. So one is, if someone's thinking about being a donor, how should you conceive of your obligations now deciding to be a donor? The strongest view, which is definitely not my view, but is a view held by some people, is that the donor effectively is a parent, and to the extent, like in the full-blooded sense, and to the extent that they're not involved, then they've effectively abandoned their children. That's a very, very strong view. I kind of think the right answer is the donor needs to be willing to be open, but I don't just mean that in the technical sense of having their information available, but that both the donor and people that are using donors should think that they are putting the ball in the court of the children, and that it's up to the children to then decide whether they want nothing to do with the donor, something to do with the donor. And here I think it matters that to the extent that we have empirical research on what it is that donors want. I think Anya's experience reflects what we know, which is that donor-conceived people tend not to be looking for another parent, but just to know, to get information, to talk. And I think that's a totally reasonable set of expectations. So that's if you're becoming a donor. A different question is, what if you anonymously donated 20 years ago, 30 years ago, 40 years ago, back when you thought you would remain anonymous? Now what are your obligations? That's a trickier question. I'm inclined to think that openness and honesty just is the best policy all around, and so that someone who was an anonymous donor should think very, very, very very seriously about making themselves available and certainly not closing the door. I was speaking to someone the other day, actually, who found out who their donor was through another family member of the donor, and that family member said, well, that person was already contacted by another one of their genetic offspring and was so shocked that they don't want anything to do with it ever again. And so you know, don't reach out to him. And my feeling is that is not the correct spirit. Though it defies what you signed up for, in fact, you should bring yourself around to be open about these things.
We have some more questions here. Someone asks if placing value on knowing your biological parents devalues the relationship with your adoptive or social parents, and how do you balance those things? Maybe Anya, do you want to go first?
Yeah, I feel like in my case, it does in some way. Just because like that's how I've chosen to think about it in my mind. But I don't think that is the case for like the majority of people that I've spoken to that I know who are also donor conceived. Like people have space in their like hearts and their heads for like more than one person that they like feel connected to or care about just in general. And if you were raised by one or two people and one of them or both of them are not genetically related to you, like you can still care about them and also care about like someone who is genetically related to you. And yeah, I think for me, it's been like kind of in my own mind, like it has devalued my own relationship with my like non-biological father. But I think that's like a situation specific to me.
Anya, I don't want to speak on your behalf, but it seems important in your case that your non-biological father, in his mind, the biological tie like really, really mattered. So in his mind, that was the thing that really defines the parental relationship, and that seems like that's part of the reason why it's diminished your relationship with him. But that if people don't have such a strong view about what makes someone a parent, then that then opens the door for the parents of donor-conceived children who are not genetically related to them to be parents in the fullest sense, in the sense that I think matters the most. And for the child to be attached to the parent in the fullest sense, while nonetheless having room for this other person. The only other thing I'll add is I think part of it is that we, because this is all relatively new, we don't really have the concepts to describe the relationships, and that makes it hard. It's hard to know even what terms to use. And so I mean, Libby was suggesting this, we're kind of working out new forms of relationships. And that it is hard in the beginning is in part due to the fact that we don't have these well-trod paths that we can fall into. We don't have well-defined social roles, and so much of how we navigate the world is by falling into social roles that have been sort of defined for us already. And so I think there's no reason why families that are created in this way couldn't have extended relationships with people who, again, we have trouble even talking about it with clear terms, that allow for, I mean, complete and full love within families between social parents and their children, while still allowing room for significance for this other person.
So, more questions. Do you think it's a basic human right to know the identity of your biological parents? And is it ethically permissible to deny some people this information based on how they were born? I think that's one's over to you as well, Daniel.
I suppose my silence is slightly telling. So part of my silence is that I, just in my own philosophical thinking, am not sure what to make of rights in general. So to the extent that I don't know how to answer the question, that's because I would want to think this might sound like a punt, but it's true. Think more seriously about what makes a right a human right. Having said that, I do think, given some of what I've said, both about the culturally mediated nature of the interest, which in no way denies its presence or its significance, and the fact that I think not everyone has the interest, to me makes it different than what I would think of as canonical human rights. But to say that it's not a canonical human right is not, I mean, sorry, by canonical, I just mean like the first thing you might think of as a human right, like rights to some basic security, adequate sustenance, freedom from torture, for example. But that doesn't mean to say it's not, and it's also not, it also doesn't mean that it's not in fact a right. So I think the account I've given could very well be used to conclude donor conceived people have a right to this information. So that's the complicated answer. Though I know it makes some people unhappy if the answer isn't straightforwardly yes. But that's what I think.
Okay. A question for Libby about whether or not there are mental health issues associated with people searching and finding out genetic information.
Yeah, I mean, I think, we, I don't want to speak for everyone because obviously, this is not my experience. I'm a journalist and I interview people. And there's certainly some amount of self-selection happening for sure, where I'm talking to folks who made a discovery and are deeply invested in knowing more. So I sort of start with that. But for those folks that I have talked to, and I've talked to a lot of people who took a DNA test and discovered something surprising about their genetic origins, and that sent them on this kind of journey that, it's probably like a lifelong thing. Very often did describe that discovery almost in terms of a trauma. And it's not that they would have felt that way if they had known early on. In other words, it's not the information, it's the finding out in this way well into your adulthood without ever having been told directly by your family, right? So it's the damage that it does sometimes to the relationship with the parents who raised you. It's the having to go back and rethink your own life in light of this now footnoted information, right? It basically puts everything in the context of your narrative up till now in doubt, and it often makes people feel completely disoriented. And so they, I think of it as like we all have our own narratives that we kind of, we kind of bring to the world and are mediated by other people. And if you want to think of it a bit like the game of Jenga, right? And you've got like all the blocks, right? And if you pull one from the bottom, very often the whole thing comes down. If my genetic origins or my once upon a time, the beginning of my story is not what I thought, it's not like you just take out that one block and then you proceed, right? Everything changes because of this revelation. And so, yeah, I mean, people do often need somebody to help them through that. And at the moment, what exists for the most part, there is some mental health assistance for people. There's a group called the MPE Counseling Collective. But, a lot of what people find is Facebook groups, which is great, but it's grassroots. And there's not yet, and there needs to be, I think, much more of a kind of formal help for folks and formal network and, kind of health assistance for them in these situations so that they can get through it as well as possible, because it is often a trauma for people.
Thanks. I want to thank everybody for taking part. This has been a terrific conversation. We haven't got to all the questions, but thanks to Daniel, and thanks to Anya, and thanks to Libby, and thanks to Kristen for your help. And thanks to the Carleton College, for the Humanities Center, and the Ethical Inquiry at Carleton College for sponsoring the event. We'll be following up on your questions and reading them in chat, and I think this will be recorded for those who want to watch it again or watch it later. So thank you very much, everybody. Thanks. Take care.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.